So it's the 3rd of December and it's time to open up the third window on the TooFatLardies 2022 Advent Calendar. So as I prise open the window, the question inside, ladies and gentlemen, is how has your painting style changed over the years? What a question. Well, we could be here for literally days talking about the different ways in which we paint miniature figures. And I guess the question's all about how we paint the figures as opposed to how the painting style changes with what we're painting. Because in a lot of ways, if you're painting 100 figures, you might end up painting them slightly different to just simply one miniature figure on the painting table in front of you. So I'm going to leave that question because I think the question in the window is really asking about painting style and how my style's changed over the years. I think that's a lot to do with practice. As somebody said, once you paint 2,000 miniature war games figures, you're probably going to get okay at it by the end, as opposed to when you start on the first figure. I think that's very true. I think the other aspect is that the products which we've got to paint with have just increased in quality so much since I started painting war games figures in the early 80s. Lord, about 40 years ago. I remember when I was starting out at school painting war games figures, we used Humbrol enamels and white spirit to thin them down. And they were particularly evil smelling paints, and they still are. And I remember my mum was never particularly keen on me painting at the kitchen table in case I spilled them on the floor and wrecked whatever flooring we had down there underneath the kitchen table. So Humbrol enamels weren't easy to use, although I look back at the figures that I did paint with them and they still have taken the test of time reasonably well, I think. But certainly in the 90s and onwards, the increased availability of good quality water-based acrylic paints has made a huge difference to painting. I remember the first time in the early 90s, I started using Plaka acrylics, which were imported from Germany. They were just a game changer. They allowed me to blend colours, layer colours more effectively. And then in the early 2000s, when I discovered Vallejo paints, again, it was a similar game-changing moment that I just found that those paints were so easy to use, easy to mix, easy to thin down. So certainly style has changed with the availability of different components. And I think over the years, I've also tried different painting styles. Started out in the early 80s, really very much like an article from one of the early White Dwarfs in blacklining the figures I was painting, so with a white undercoat, but blacklining around all the different folds in the figure's clothing, chainmail, anything metallic, and between the legs and under the arms. And that worked reasonably well and helped fill in the white bits and leaving a black outline around different shaded areas. But I moved on from there to start using inks, Winsor & Newton inks to start with, and that really was the way in which I used to paint figures until probably the early mid-90s, when I started looking at techniques like the Kevin Dellamore's 3 layers techniques and trying to, once watercolours were available, blending colours to get different levels of coverage on the figures. And that kind of negated the use of inks and shades for quite a while. And I used that technique for about 15 to 20 years. And only recently have I come back really to starting using shades and inks again. And when I say inks, it's really the sort of shade colours from Games Workshop or Vallejo, or also the Army Painter inks. And they are really good to save time, and they give a really nice effect on all sorts of different clothing or fur or any part of the figure in which the sculpting gives an element of relief, in which the ink or the shade can pool. And I've come back to doing that because I like the effect that that creates. It's very visually pleasing, and it kind of does the same work as very careful layering, but in a fraction of the time. So that's really been one of the ways in which I've tried to create larger units, which still stand out on the tabletop. So different ways of painting using the products which are available. I think that's something which I've changed over the years. I think the other thing which has really changed, and looking back at the figures I painted like 30, 40 years ago, in preparing to open the advent calendar window, let's say, giving away no secrets there, has been the way in which I've based figures. So in the 80s, I'm struggling to think of that many people who really spent a lot of time over basing figures. And a lot of the armies I've got from that period are fairly uninteresting basing, painted green or pale brown, depending on the terrain in which they were going to be standing on in the game. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, I got very, very interested in trying to base the figures in increasingly scenic bases. So I started layering the bases, adding tufts and tree stumps and brickwork and all sorts of extra bits and pieces on the base to really fit the figures into the terrain in which they were standing. And that carried on for quite a while until really the last couple of years, when I took a step back and started thinking about how I wanted the terrain to look and interrelate with the figures on the table. And I've almost moved away from doing scenic basing to really very plain basing, which is capable of allowing the figures to be part of the terrain fairly seamlessly, where there's a flat baseboard in a very neutral colour. And that's really where I see the painting style that I have at the moment, is really viewing the figures as being part of the terrain and really fitting in with the terrain, and not obviously being placed as part of a unit on a tabletop. And that's why I wanted to have, on the games we've played of Flashing Blades and the Samurai Japanese version of Flashing Blades, I wanted to have a plain basing which would fit in with the small-sized tabletop we've been using. Very neutral colours for the basing to give maximum flexibility, but also with very neutral colours to highlight and bring to the foreground the colours of the clothing and armour which the figures are wearing. So seeing the painting as being part of the terrain and fitting in with the terrain is definitely something which I'm trying to do more over the last couple of years. And seeing the figures as part of a wider game, with the painting theme extending from just the figures to the terrain and also the buildings which sit on the terrain. So everything is part of a whole and a design. That's really something which I think is a really fun area to explore. So that's been my description of how my painting styles changed from the years, probably driven by products, but also by thinking about games in a slightly different way as the years go by.